Hey everybody, welcome back to Drew the Catholic. Have a really special guest for you today. I've been admiring his content for a long time, and it's about time that I think we brought Chris Plance on to chat about YouTube, theology, and all that type of stuff. So we have Chris on today. Chris, how's it going?
Everything's good. Yeah,
Good.
appreciate you having me on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for making the time. I think it was like maybe 2 or 3 months ago. I think Haley, which everyone on Catholic YouTube knows Haley. She had posted one of your videos, and I really liked your content and connected with the way that you were putting your messages out and stuff. And I think we reached out, and we've been trying to schedule stuff. And you know how it is. You have kids, I have kids, and it's crazy. But here we are, and I'm really excited to have a conversation. But I figure, yeah, just tell us a bit about your background, Chris, and what you do, and your channel, and what you do outside of that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Drew, for having me. And thank you for your patience because it's been a few months. I've been pretty busy, so appreciate you being patient. I'm glad that we finally got, the opportunity to connect and talk. So I grew up in Los Angeles, and I went to Catholic school my whole life, went to Catholic grade school, went to Catholic high school, and then eventually went to college in Santa Barbara. And that's where sort of I had my reconversion. I went to go play baseball purely, but I went to Westmont College, which is a small kind of conservative in quotation marks, evangelical school in Santa Barbara. And I went there to just basically play baseball. At that point, I had gone to Catholic school, but I was kind of like an atheist at that time. And by the time I got to college, all my buddies on the baseball team were all Christians and loved Jesus. So I ended up reading some books that they had recommended, gave my life to Christ, and then started going a little bit to some Protestant churches, more like Calvary Chapel type Baptist churches.
Okay.
And just for a little bit, briefly,
Mm-hmm.
and then reverted back to the Catholic Church. And so that's kind of where my sort of Catholic journey picks up, because over the next 4 years, like, I just became a theology nerd. I loved baseball. I was still working on trying to go pro in baseball and make that a career. But I, got to my senior year. I was like, I just want to study theology. I'm a total nerd. Like, I would spend, the last like 4 years, the 3.5 years of my college just sitting in my room, reading
Mm-hmm.
theology books and geeking out about the Bible and stuff. So, long story short, that's where I realized I had this great desire to go study theology. So I went and studied theology at Franciscan University for a few years, and had a great time at Franciscan. I got to live with Scott Hahn. So I got to live with Scott and
Oh, cool.
Kimberly and their youngest son, David. And that was a huge, huge blessing. And so I went there for a few years, and then went over to John Paul the Great Catholic University in San Diego, Escondido area. And then after that, went and worked in Bakersfield. And, I love teaching. I love teaching theology. That's kind of my passion. And so I just loved being in the classroom teaching. But I'm also sort of apostolic. I like to evangelize. I like to put projects together. I think schools are really important. And so I'm a huge fan of the classical Catholic education movement. Like, if there's a town or a city that doesn't have a classical Catholic school and they need help, I kind of like to, jump in and say, yeah, you could do this. Let's do this.
That's awesome.
So, but my real passion really is Los Angeles. That's my huge passion. It's where I'm from. It's where I
Hmm.
grew up. I think it's the second largest diocese in the world, and it has a lot of potential. It also has it's a huge cultural influence on America and the wider world. And so I see it as important. And so I'm kind of here, back home, trying to do whatever I can to help advance the church's mission here in Los Angeles. So
Hmm.
I also have other like theological interests of mine. I love the biblical narrative. I love Paul. I'm confused by Paul a lot, and so that keeps me occupied a lot of my time
Nice.
trying to piece together why he says this and says that. And
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
and even the Gospels as well. So I'm kind of a Bible nerd in that sense. And then you know, I've just recently kind of gotten into more politics and culture stuff, just because of the way that I'm in reading the Bible.
Hmm.
That I think that um, the biblical narrative actually links up with sort of a public theology, a political theology, and I think it gives us the context for understanding like the lay vocation and the role of the bishops and stuff like that. So,
Hmm.
um, so anyways, yeah, I have a YouTube channel, and that's where I sort of starting to get out these ideas to the public, to get some pushback and to get some feedback, and I like hearing responses, see what's landing. And so anyways, yeah, I appreciate the YouTube Catholic community. I eat up a lot of its content as much as I can, so it's fun to kind of jump in and you know, be a small part of it.
Yeah,
I
I
also
really.
I also have kids, and I have a wife and 6 kids, and that's where I spend most of my time.
So yeah, you have lots of free time.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
No, I really like your style on YouTube. You know, and the points you bring up are really always timely because they're always related to culture and stuff. But you know, I think one thing that like the Catholic YouTube world has done well is create a lot of places for like committed Catholics to rest and to create culture and to think through things together. But at the same time, and I've been thinking through this a lot lately, at the same time, in some ways, I feel like it's kind of fallen prey to like what everyone in the creator community, whether it's Catholic or not, has fallen prey to, and that's being like really clickbaity and like having a strong statement and sort of getting charged up by it, you know. And it's kind of one of those things where like the algorithm, you know, rewards you for being novel or inflammatory, so then your audience watches it because they want to see it, so then you do it, you know. It kind of becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. But it's really good to have content like yours where you're talking about tough things and you have this faithful response. But I mean, just the charity in your content, I would have a hard time putting forth, I'll be honest. Like with some of the stuff you've talked about, I'm like, wow, he's being so, like, you're having the conversation and you're assuming goodwill, which is so hard to do online. I think it's so easy to say, well, that guy put out that video and he's being inflammatory, or this thing happened in the world and it's really insane, you know, crazy, whatever adjective. And it's easy to kind of fall into that trap. But like, you know, and I think this is, you know, you had said, you know, you have this apostolic desire, this evangelistic desire. It's not as effective to be that way, right? Because we could sequester off into our little Catholic corner of the internet and kind of have our own rally camp or whatever. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be effective in evangelizing the world. Whereas I feel like your approach could do that, right? Because if someone watched one of your videos, it's faithful, it's well thought out, and at the same time, it's not so polemicized for an already Catholic community or someone that's like in your particular, I guess you could say, strain of your, you know, Catholicism. It's more open. I feel like people will be more open to it. And I'm trying to be that way with my content, right? It's hard because you want to grow, you want to get clicks, but not at the expense of, at least for me, not at the expense of being evangelistic, you know?
Yeah. What do you mean by evangelistic?
Uh,
Like preachy, or more
um,
like?
no, I mean like being evangelistically effective. Like
Oh, I see.
I
I
could
see.
probably put out some hot takes that within certain communities they'd be like, yeah, that's awesome, and I agree with that. But then it would be isolating people that maybe I'm trying to draw closer to
Yeah.
Catholicism, right? Or it would like
Yeah.
cut off a conversation. And I've been thinking a lot about this, right? Because it's like there's a lot of tension. I feel like just in the world in general, but even within Catholicism, within Catholic communities. And it's really easy to start kind of tribalizing as opposed to like reaching across the table and conversing, right? But it seems like, at least with some of your content, you're trying to do that, whether it's within Catholicism or with culture at large, to have a conversation and still be able to have like tough talking points,
Yeah.
and disagree even maybe, but not be so charged that you're just kind of attacking somebody or having a strong statement at the expense of, you know, being open to a conversation. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
No.
Yeah, yeah.
Totally. And it's hard when you get it's hard when you get attacked, and or you strongly disagree with someone, and you know, it's just I think that, yeah, I think that like thinking about what is this gonna accomplish? Like if
Right.
I create a video and I just scream, at somebody because they got something wrong, like I really don't think it's effective. So
Hmm.
I think that um people are generally uh fearful, or they're ruled by their passions, and
Hmm.
so trying to bring down the passions as much as possible. And it really does help if they feel like you have goodwill and sincerely, like really
Hmm.
praying through it and saying, yeah, like I really do love this person, let's talk through this,
Right.
and praying about what's the best way, Lord, that we can carry this conversation forward. But being inflammatory and passionate, it really just allows the passions, which are already disordered,
Hmm.
and they're already overcoming our will throughout our life, and that's part of the fall. If we can kind of um try to lower those a little bit and just have a conversation where someone just feels loved. I mean, I've seen it I've seen it so many times in my conversations where I have
Hmm.
people that that I'm friends with that disagree with me on a bunch of stuff, and I'm just like, this always goes nowhere if we're
Right.
talking in a certain way. And if we're just chatting with one another, we assume goodwill, and then we just know when the conversation needs to end. Like, okay, we just agree to disagree, so
Right.
um but yeah, I mean, there's definitely the temptation to be clickbaity. I've kind of been on YouTube for the last several years, actually, just on different podcasts and different shows and stuff, even though I just recently started my own channel. So I've sort of been aware of,
Hmm.
the temptation to do the clickbaity thing or to jump into a conversation. And you're totally right. If you can get part of an argument, if you can become part of an argument, or you can pick that one topic that people are like, they're gonna actually show up and watch your video, but
Hmm.
they are going, like, a lot of these people are just gonna hate what you're saying. It's just, and also
Right.
too, you have to think about your judgment as well. That's a
Hmm.
huge thing. Like, if you're praying consistently, you're doing examination of conscience every night, and you're thinking about your final judgment, where, as Paul says in Romans 2, you have to give an account, right?
Hmm.
And Jesus says as well, for every word that we said. Then it also helps, thinking about, like, contemplating you standing there in front of Jesus and having to give an account. So
Right. Yeah, I already know there's some memes that I've shared that I'm like, oh, that's gonna not be a fun conversation, right? But that's interesting because like that what you said about the final judgment, there's sort of this idea on the internet right now that like the internet for a long time has been this completely anonymous place, and in some sense maybe that's been like a feature that's been, you could say, good in a way, but at the same time that anonymity sort of breeds some of that hostility, I think, right? Because if we're not
oh,
being held
totally.
accountable immediately by what we're saying, well, but then to think, well, yeah, you might not be held accountable by the YouTube community or by the Catholic community on YouTube or by your friends because they don't know it was you, but you will be held accountable by Jesus for what you say online. Yeah, that's huge to remember. I think it's also, I've been thinking about this, and I'd love to get your take on it. It's one of those things too where uh, it's so interesting being on this side of it because all of my conversations and a lot of creators are the same way, are very off the cuff. They're very laid back, right? Like you and I are just chatting right now, and it happens to be recorded, and we're going to post it for potentially hundreds of people to see, which is kind of insane to think about historically. But then at the same time, that this conversation becomes frozen, and anyone can go back and reference it and bring up like what was said here. So if I misspeak, or if you misspeak, or maybe don't frame a point exactly how you would, like in a normal conversation, there's a lot of give and take if there's goodwill. And then online, when that doesn't happen, it's kind of interesting to have people hold your feet to the fire for something that, and this has already happened to me, where I'm like, I kind of said that off the cuff in an interview, right? But then to remember, without getting frozen to where you don't speak at all, but to remember that like what we're saying gets recorded, and it can come back to haunt you even now, right? There's like temporal consequences for it. Um, that's a
Yeah.
bit of a sidebar, but I've just been thinking about that because it's so interesting. Like most of the conversations I have over a beer with friends, all sorts of stuff gets said that like if it was like broadcast on public television, we'd be in
Yeah.
trouble, right? And everyone kind of has conversations like that where you're speaking freely and candidly and maybe not that committed to your final point, but it's hard when it becomes online because that filter gets lost, I think, a lot of times with the audience. and then someone will like
Yeah.
say something, and then if you're on the wrong side of that, you get hurt, and then it just it kind of breeds that division. What do you think, kind of in that vein of approaching those conversations online, what do you think we can do to reach across the aisle? Because I think about this, like there are things in culture or even in the church with other Catholics that I think need to be discussed, and do it in a way that's unitive, right? And in a way that builds those bridges. How do we do that?
Well, I think it I think it takes practice. I think a lot of people that struggle with, say, engaging with like what we would call a liberal Catholic or a cafeteria Catholic,
Yeah.
they live in they just don't have any interaction with them, and so it's easy to just assume that this is how this person is. If as soon as I categorize someone in the bad category, which of course in scripture, like
Right.
that's precisely what Jesus is trying to destroy, that it's not actually as easy as it seems to put this person in the bad category and this person in the good category. He's trying to say it's actually much more complex and interesting than that. And I think that I think that when you say live in a place where you are only familiar with this kind of Catholic and you don't interact with anybody else.
Yeah.
Pope Francis talks about this a lot, where it's like, you should get out there and actually talk with people who disagree with you. Or look, when you live in Los Angeles, you get, I mean, again, it's over 4 million Catholics. You have more Catholics here just in Los Angeles Archdiocese than you have people in the bottom, I don't know, 5 states, 10 states. So you have a lot of Catholics, and you have a lot of what we would call like liberal Catholics who maybe are pro-women priests, but then also like staunchly pro-life. And you're like, wow, this is kind of,
it's an interesting combination. Yeah.
Yeah. Like they're part of the pro-life ministry, but then they're also, pro-female, priesthood or something. And it's just like, okay, these categories, and then like you're doing work with them, or you're interacting with them because they're at your local parish. Or like on the other flip side, if you only are in like the more progressive Catholic camp, and you don't actually talk with a traditional, more minded Catholic, then you're going to categorize them as, you're going to put them in a box. And when you actually engage with people and you actually meet people and you actually become friends with people, you start to realize that these categories are they actually don't work. More bad Catholics versus good Catholics sort of thing. And then you practice, because you have friendships with them, like what it's like interacting with them. And then you get used to like saying, yeah, I mean, we talk and we work together, and then, and then we just have disagreements. And then you get better at having those conversations where you're just disagreeing with each other and smiling, and you're staunchly disagreeing with each other. So I think it takes a little practice. Just like friendship in general. Like if you don't have a social life, you can be somewhat like socially awkward, they say, just because you haven't put into practice this skill of being social and talking with people. And I think sometimes that if you don't practice that, like how to have a conversation with someone maybe you disagree with, and then you don't have the skills that are where you're able to navigate that, then you start reacting in a way that is not conducive to the conversations. Like, hey, that's actually not going to help people the way you say it like that. That's not going to help actually advance the conversation. So I think, like having the problem is especially in the church right now, the left and the right don't really want to talk to each other. Like, some people in the super traditionalist camp like can't sit down and have a conversation with someone who might actually disagree with them. And then and that's bad, because you need that pushback. You need to start having conversations with people that might disagree with you, and that's a skill that how do you talk to people that disagree with you, that think Vatican II, for example, didn't have errors in it or heresy. You also have the same goes for the left. So I think it's just a matter of just having it. Pope Francis is right. Like people just need to have more conversations, reach out to other people and disagree. And I think that's the best. That's the best way to kind of go about it.
No, I think I completely agree. Like, me and some buddies have even noticed this just in our own interactions within our parish. I live in an interesting place in that there's only one parish for our town, which is a blessing in
Mhm.
that it kind of forces us to be with each other. We can't just
Yeah.
like parish hop to a community that's more like me. And it's been challenging, but it's been good because like we have struggles where like in terms of how to approach what we have for music is one example, right? Where there's differences of opinion. And in some cases you might even say like in terms of theology or in terms of practice, there are people who are like wrong, but it's not helpful to just be like, oh, well, have you read Sacrosanctum Concilium? But it's better to be like, we've had conversations and you learn what their concerns are, and then that kind of shows you why they might fall into this camp, and they might think that this is what it should be, and then vice versa. Like one specific example, we had like a musicians meeting, and one of the guys was kind of like starting to rail on people who liked having Latin, not even the Latin mass, but just like when we would sing the Latin propers. And he's like, I don't get why all these young people want Latin. We can't understand it. And I just kind of explained that for a lot of us, it was, returning to this deep sense of meaning when we had grown up, many of us without a deep sense of meaning, just thinking about the culture at
Mhm.
large, especially among young people. There's like high rates of depression and not, there's like sort of this air of nihilism that we grew up in. And then to have something that's rooted like that is almost an antidote to that. And then he totally understood it. And he's like, oh, well then yeah, maybe we should talk about doing that. I didn't realize that's why it was, helping the young people, right? So it's just like a simple conversation
Yeah.
like that, and then all of a sudden we have a bridge, and like we might not both be getting exactly what we want. We all have our preferences and arguments and things like that, but now like our parish has moved forwards and I feel more connected to him, right? I think it's really interesting when you add online to that though, because I mean, like, technically you and I are just sitting alone in rooms where computer screens are translating video and audio. So it feels like we're having a conversation. And that's still like something, but it is different when it translates into the real world. So I've been thinking about this and I wonder if you have any thoughts. Like, how can my
Mhm.
efforts as a Catholic YouTuber, as someone who's making content online, how can I make sure it doesn't just stay here, right? Like, how can I make sure that I'm not just kind of trying to trap people in an audience, generate views, and then just kind of keep them here so that I'm, doing what Facebook and YouTube do best, like farm your attention. But how can I like activate people to maybe come, to my channel and be inspired or be lifted up or have edifying conversations, and then be catapulted into action, right? Because I think that's going to be essential. Like, how can we not just reach across the table with people we know, but even digitally, build bridges among Catholics and then between Catholics and other groups, and then launch that into real world action, because that's incarnational. Like, I've been thinking a lot about that. Like, the digital world on its own wants to just kind of rip us out of the physical and keep us here, but how can we reverse that and make it like the gospel, where we might connect here initially, but something real can come of it, which might be contrary to like the design of some of these things. I don't know. There's a bit of a scattered thought going on here, but that's what I've been thinking about, that because I don't think ultimately, at least for my own content, I don't think I'll deem it as effective unless it is kind of going from the cloud to the ground. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I
Yeah.
mean, we were just discussing we road trip across the United States, and I'm like, oh, we now that Drew is a friend of mine, we should make a hour south detour from our trip and just go visit Drew, and
Yeah.
where he's at. And I totally agree. I mean, one of the cool things about doing the online thing is you connect with people all
Hmm.
across the United States and the world, and it is good to actually try to meet up in person,
Hmm.
and try to actually build that friendship. It's at the same time, it's always the it's good to also have like and to realize sort of the expectations of your communications with people online, because really the people that it seems like need your attention most are the people actually in your local community, so you can't
Hmm.
forget them. And but at the same time, yeah, trying to, I don't know, I think that's a challenge. Um I haven't thought about that much,
Hmm.
honestly. I mean, I try to put out content that I hope that not necessarily isn't incarnated with sort of me at the center of it, like invite me out to speak or be part of the
Right.
the guys night, but is a conversation. Sort of, I raise questions within my content that I'm hoping people take to their local Catholic communities and discuss, discuss it among themselves. So sort of maybe giving content for already incarnated communities is kind of like the way that I look at it. Like, I'm not looking to take, hopefully like there already are communities, and my content's not really creating them, but really just sprinkling down and saying, hey, here's some stuff to think about.
Right. Yeah. It gives them something to continue the conversations they're already having. No, that's really good too. And I think a lot of that's your approach too. And that we could maybe talk about that next. I think one of the things that I first was attracted to about your content is you and I think similarly in that I'm always trying to read the world through the lens of scripture, and get a really good sense of here's the narrative of the Bible. Here's, and it's almost typology in a way of like, here's a thing that happened in scripture and this thing is like that. Or how can the events of scripture, the narratives of scripture inform something similar happening in the world? And I think that's a really helpful lens. Can you kind of describe your process in that? Like, how do you do that? You're seeing something happen in the world. You have this awareness of the Bible. How's that synthesis happen in your mind?
Yeah. So I spend most of my time with pretty like academic-y theology books, that are, they cost a lot of money. Like any free, any extra money I have, I'm spending. Like, for example, this book that's right by my desk, like Paul's Ecclesia as, civil assembly. And it's super nerdy. Like maybe there's like 5 of us that actually bought the book, but it's huge because what Park is doing is saying when Paul used the word ecclesia, church, like what did he actually mean? And so I spent a lot of my time trying to get into the minds of Paul and Matthew and the New Testament authors primarily. And then I try to like sort of think their thoughts after them. Like, why did they say that? So what I try to do is, like, for example, Bishop Barron. So what I try to do is I see something going on and I feel like if the Holy Spirit's drawing me to this, I would say something like to myself, I'd say, what would Paul say in this situation? Let's say this situation, he hears about this conversation between Heidi Presbula and Bishop Barron, and who had an interaction on Twitter. What would Paul say in this situation? And so the video I have coming out today or tomorrow on my YouTube channel is to try to do that. So for example, Heidi Presbula had said something about, the problem with these Christian nationalists is that they say they speak for God. Bishop Barron shot off this video that was like, hey, like, the Supreme Court doesn't give us our rights. God gives us our rights. And what you seem to be saying is dangerous in that.
Yeah. Like Supreme what a disaster.
And I actually think that the point that she was actually raising is a really good point, which is that, look, the problem that we have in America is that who speaks for God? You have Protestant nationalists who speak for God. You have the Supreme Court, who we think are the ones who give us our rights, many Americans, or the Constitution, for example. But then there is the question, the really live question as to who speaks for God. And so, okay, this is going on. This conversation's happening. What would Paul say? And so I think Paul would say, the Christian nationalists don't. Bishop Barron does. He's one of our successors.
Right.
So Bishop Barron and the Pope speak for God. And so what I try to do is try to, squeeze. There's this small conversation happening, and it's an opportunity for me to insert something that I think Paul would say and then blow it up and open everyone's eyes to the biblical narrative. So to cast this controversy within the larger question, which seems to be the question of the scriptures, which is who speaks for God. Israel is chosen, Abraham is chosen in Genesis 12. He's given a mission in 12, 15, 17, 22. Then it's extended all through, the various patriarchs. Then it's reformulated and upgraded and extended in with David's reign. And then ultimately through the eternal word, which is Jesus Christ. And then that they seem to be asking the question that Heidi and Bishop Barron are asking, which is who speaks for God? And I try to, I think that's what I try to do. I don't look at every controversy as like an opportunity. Like I don't want to push it too much. I just
Hmm.
say,
Hmm.
okay, pray about this specific thing that's happening, and then if it's an opportunity, you know, try to see if I could not speak for Paul or Matthew or John or Luke, but say this seems to be what they're saying, and
Right.
they seem to have answered that question.
No, I think that's brilliant, and that's a very Pauline method too, right? I mean, he says, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ," and you're imitating him, right? Because I can't help but think of, like when he's at Mars Hill and there's the unknown God, and he says, "Well, I know this God," right? Like he's taking a touch point for the moment and the culture and the people he's speaking to, and rather than trying to be how do I want to say this? Rather than trying to be so pure that you just present the gospel or present these truths as something that's completely detached from the world they're living in, you're actually
Yeah.
using their real life experience and their actual questions and struggles as a touch point to introduce this greater reality,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that's for me, that's like the most effective method of evangelization, because people already have these things they care about, these things they believe, or these questions and concerns they have that they're wrestling with, and to actually to meet them there and open that up in the context of what they're wrestling with is way more
Totally.
effective and just gracious, right? Instead of being like, well, you just have to give all that up and move over here and change everything. It's like, well, we can draw them in slowly with the own natural questions and inclinations of their of the human heart that everyone kind of has in their own bend. And at least for me, that's insofar as I've approached evangelism that way, it's been way more effective than having just like a bunch of apologetics arguments that I can rattle off, like a script. But to actually sit with someone and like you were saying, even with that example with Bishop Barron Heidi, actually listen that the thing that she's saying might be this, but the thing behind that is a really deep question, right? Of like who speaks
Hmm.
for God. That's huge, right? But that takes a lot of patience, I think, to sit with, because we can hear the surface level, which I remember I saw
Yeah.
that clip, and that my reaction was like most people's. It was like, oh man, if you say the Supreme Court is where our rights come from, that's going to be a disaster. So I just kind of wrote it off. But what a good point that there's a deeper question behind the question, right? Which to me is, yeah, Pauline, but also like pretty rabbinical and pretty like in terms of that thought of like, what's the question behind the question? What's the deeper thing that's going on here? And if we can find that, then we have a touch point with which to converse with someone and pull them in to the gospel, right?
Totally. And
Yeah.
Heidi in that situation does have I mean, she is sort of taking on, as I point out in my video, she is taking on sort of a magisterial role too. Like, sure, the
Hmm.
Protestant nationalists are claiming to speak for God or interpret his word.
Right.
And Heidi claims to also speak for God because
Hmm.
she can decide who doesn't speak for God, namely the Christian nationalists.
Right.
So what it's an opportunity to say, this is, as I say in the video, this is a perpetual problem. It will always remain with America
Hmm.
until truth becomes the main criterion, which
Hmm.
is who does speak for God. And
Hmm.
I think Catholics, I think everyone in America needs to just put their, as I also say in the video, everyone has a worldview. And I think America, we've tried to basically pretend that people don't. And we're
Right.
like, let's all just have this worldview where nobody has a worldview.
Yeah. It's like this
And
empty
what I'm
slate.
saying is
Yeah.
exactly. And what I'm saying is like, look, we Catholics admit we have a
Hmm.
worldview. Bishop Barron speaks for God. The bishops
Hmm.
and the Pope in union with
Hmm.
him, like that's our worldview. That's a Matthew 16:19,
Hmm.
John 20, worldview, which is that these bishops are his ambassadors and
Hmm.
they interpret his word for us. They talk to it. I mean, they don't do all of it, right? And they can err. But typically these are God's anointed ones. So,
Hmm.
but going back, I think, excuse me, I think that Pope Francis, he gets flack for anything anytime he puts something out, but he did put out this motu proprio a while back called it was the meaning of it was to promote theology, was ad theologium
Hmm.
promovendum, and it was to promote theology. And what he said was that, look, I want theology to move in the direction of where it finally hits the ground, like, and starts to grow, like actually water specific communities.
Hmm.
So I want theology to be done among the people. And And I think that really this isn't a new approach. This is the original approach
Yeah.
of theology, because as I've made on various, I've made this comment on other channels. Um, St. Paul is, in my mind, the founder of Catholic theology. He's the founder of theology, not Thomas or Augustine or Jerome, but or even Matthew and Mark. Like, Paul really is the founder of Catholic theology, and Catholic theology is then shaped by Paul with letters to specific communities.
Mm-hmm.
So he's actually working out on the ground exactly what Francis is sort of asking us to do, which is, rather than writing a textbook, like, write a letter, do theology in the letter shaped way that Paul invented it, which is that, have in mind, of course, it's not wrong to have textbooks and all that, but I think that, excuse me, considering the fact that Paul invented Catholic theology, if we can say that, by writing letters to specific communities and saying, this is your specific situation, now consider it from within the larger promises and of God to Israel, and then fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and all that. So I do think that what I'm trying to do is kind of a Pauline move there, which is saying, here's something that's happening right now. How do we squeeze the biblical narrative into it? And that's kind of my approach.
Yeah, well, and like to I guess just kind of ponder that and think through that in a way. That's just, Paul's method there is also, and I'm told this is totally just thoughts that are hitting my head, so no one hold my feet to the fire. That's also sort of God's method throughout the biblical narrative as well, right? He doesn't just drop Moses the entire systematic theology of everything he wants everyone to believe for all time. There's sort of this, there's sort of this unveiling we see throughout the Old Covenant that reaches its fulfillment in Jesus Christ, of course. But also, I mean, like, I think about the prophetic office. Like, there's this within the covenant, there's this office of people calling people back in their context to faithfulness to the covenant. And it's never removed. Like, you can't remove the prophets from that moment in time, even if they're speaking into the future and, it's prophetic in that it comes back around. But the prophets are always, and I think the epistles serve a similar function. They're calling people back to covenant faithfulness within the context of what's going wrong or what's happening right now. And so there's this lived sort of relationship in those dialogues. And then us getting to read that, that's the beauty of it, is that these are things that really happened. These are communities that really went through these things with someone in a position of authority really calling them to further and deepen their relationship with God. And then in the same way, we have that structure today in the church. I think that's key. That was a key shift point, like in my thinking as well on my journey to Catholicism, is realizing that rather than just having like a static text that I can make some interesting points about, like, it, not only is the text of Scripture living and breathing, but also, the institution of the church is living and breathing and can exercise a similar function today in calling us back to that. Man, good. There's so many ways I could branch off of that too, because I'm similar in that, one of the things in my undergraduate studies that I just became obsessed with was like the work of Dr. N.T. Wright and the whole new perspective on Paul, and recontextualizing, first century Judaism within the New Testament. And then it just like comes alive, right? And then realizing, the text of Scripture isn't just like an interesting narrative that has a lot to say about that time back then, but it's so profound that it always is relevant to like what's happening now, right? Like, there are so many things in the world where if you have a mind that's formed by the Scriptures, you start to see those motifs come up again. And it's almost like seeing typology come alive. Like almost how, like, when you really understand Genesis 1 and then Noah starts drinking wine, you're like, uh-oh, I know what's coming next, right? So I think that's why it's, for Catholics, really important to have that familiarity with Scripture, because then you start to have the eyes of Scripture, like you said, and see what it's saying about the world at large, about the church, things like that.
N.T. Wright's really good at that. I've read his stuff. I haven't read some of his earlier, like the resurrection books and stuff, but his Paul texts are really have been really influential on me. Obviously Scott Hahn does a good job of that as well, bringing in the covenants and then showing how this is applicable in people's lives and stuff like that. Pope Benedict is good as well. Yeah. And I think I think that's something that's the task, and I think N.T. Wright has said this before. Like that is the task of the church, is trying to think through what that story, what the big story is. And of course, we have
Mm-hmm.
disagreements. I'm actually going to do a response video soon to Bird and Wright's Jesus and the Powers, which
Hmm.
of course they get so close, oftentimes, but they miss major
Mm-hmm.
portions of the text. You're like, oh, you went all the way up
Yeah.
to the very end, and then you looked at it, you stared at it, you pointed at it, and then you turned around and walked away.
Mm-hmm.
um but I think that is something that he's done well, that Scott Hahn's done well, that Pope Benedict's done well, that we can learn from, which is, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, is the original form of theology, which is writing to individual communities and
Mm-hmm.
then drawing out that experience that they're having and putting it within the larger biblical theology of the
Mm-hmm.
Bible, you know.
No, I think that's great. I really liked your response. Oh, I forget who the response was in specific, but it was basically bringing up some of the recent controversies with some of Pope Francis's writings, and you brought up the biblical narrative of David, and I hadn't thought about that honestly until you brought it up. You know, the biblical narrative of David being blessed by God pretty much immediately after he had done some pretty grave things, right? And to bring up the point of like, well, it's interesting. Like that really struck me because I was like, oh, of course, here's God blessing David's household, but he's not nullifying the fact or even approving of the fact that he's sinned gravely, and I think that was a really poignant thing that I don't know that a lot of people were thinking about. So that's why this work is it's definitely important, because for me, that made me pause. I was like, wow, that's exactly it, right? That God kind of has chosen to work with people in the midst of great sinfulness and bless them in the midst of great sinfulness, even in something as scandalous as, like, David and Bathsheba. I thought that was a really interesting point, and it was certainly challenging too, because then it kind of calls you to expand your view of like, okay, well then how does this work, right? Instead of being caught up in maybe like the polemics of that
Yeah.
conversation, and I don't want to rehash that whole one right now. I've talked about
Yeah.
that enough on my channel, but I thought it was really interesting because there's so many things like that, and Jesus does this a lot too, where he subverts our expectations in those ways. Subvert's probably not the right word, but because I think sometimes we can become static in our view of like, okay, here's the faith, here's how I'm supposed to practice it, this is what's right, and then we can almost, this is what I think what the Pharisees do. We can use that to build walls, right? And they even did this. Like the rabbis had these fences around the law to make sure that you never broke the law, which there's wisdom in that. But then those fences can become barriers to keeping the people out that God really wants in, right? Or barriers to a conversation with someone that might be searching for a deep answer to that question that you could engage with, but you might be tempted to like distance yourself from, I think the reason I'm bringing this up is because in our community, even we've, me and some buddies were just recently talking, like there's a sense in which we're tempted to just read a bunch of deep theology in stasis almost and become sort of, intellectually fat Catholics who maybe aren't reaching outside of that boundary line and encountering people like we were talking about earlier. And I had some friends recently just go snowboarding and kind of carpool up there and have wonderful conversations with people who are all over the place, like not Catholic, anti-Catholic, former Catholic, like the whole gamut. But they had like really productive conversations because they were open to just letting that person speak and not debating them, but really discovering like what was their issue, what is their stance, and what's their experience, and then how can we kind of draw them in with beauty or with a different experience, of like good Catholics. All that to say, I mean, it's exactly what you've been talking about, right? You're having this real encounter with living people and trying to speak truth, but not as like this, not as like an intellectual confrontation, but rather like a relational sort of encounter that draws them in. That's sort of a word salad way, I guess, to say that relational evangelism, right, is probably more
Yeah.
effective.
Yeah, and also
Yeah.
the challenge, one of the challenges that's been, I love teaching. If I could just teach in parishes the
Mhm.
Bible, like that would be my dream job.
Yeah.
Like I just love getting with a group of parishioners, like 100 or a couple hundred, and just going through the scriptures, and one of the challenges has often been getting like I just think the biblical story is just like the best. Like
Yeah, it's
I
so
just think
good.
it's the coolest. I just think it's the coolest thing. I think that there are so many twists and turns, and like I think it was Saint Jerome or Saint Gregory the Great that said, like, you know, the scriptures are shallow enough for a deer to prance across, but also deep enough for an elephant to swim in.
Hmm.
And trying to get them to be interested in swimming is very difficult. And so one of the things that I've tried to do is say, look, okay, imagine if Bishop Barron's been doing this recently with the Jesus Kyrios, Jesus is Lord, and he'll, because people have been asking him with Holy Week and Easter, you know, what is the message, what, you know, and he's
Hmm.
like, well, Jesus is Lord. And
Hmm.
he said, and these guys were killed because it's like going around and saying, look, Caesar is not my president,
Right.
Jesus is my president. It's like, what would that sound today? And then it gets people and they're like, oh, that's what,
Hmm.
wow, that's a pretty politically charged message that cuts sharply against,
Hmm.
you know, my spiritual understanding of what the kingdom meant. And Bishop Barron is like, he comes up with ways to try to draw people in. And so I've sort of gotten into a habit of seeing, like, okay, we're in Los Angeles. How do I explain what this would have sounded like in, you know, and then I draw on a
Right.
specific experience that they're having, and then um and then say that's what this would have sounded like. And so I've just gotten in the habit, and I'm like, hey, this is a good way to draw people in, sort of draw on whatever's happening in their culture and time, and then using that as like a segue into feeling more deeply what Matthew and John and Paul are trying to get across in their
Hmm.
own context.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, because it creates curiosity and that shock value, right? Like just that simple example, like Jesus is Lord. Now it's just there's so many bumper stickers and signs that say that, and everyone's like, oh, that's just, you know, those Christians over there, they have their thing, and it's so easy to forget that we're swimming in this sort of I mean, kind of postmodern, you know, like you were saying earlier, in America, we try to have this empty slate of worldviews where we sequestered off the meaning of these languages to these different communities and they don't impact us. So to put it in a context where you're almost like forced to encounter the weight of something like that is really huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff about that's really interesting. In that vein, you know, one of the things you said earlier is that you really feel committed to and love living in Los Angeles and want to, you know, do the church's mission there. That's interesting. And I want to talk about that because I feel like I'm in a similar
Yeah.
position. There's a temptation, right? As culture goes the way it goes. I don't even really have to spell it out. Everyone listening knows kind of, you know, there's a movement happening and there's a lot of things changing in the world. And that's been the direction I think it's been going for a long time. But there's a temptation, like when it happens in your city, to run, right? And like there's sort of been a mass exodus from California since the pandemic. And in Colorado, we feel that too. Like Colorado and California are very similar culturally and politically, and a lot of Californians are moving like to my town in particular, and it creates this temptation of like my my way of thinking, my way of being and living is becoming challenged, right, by liberalism, I guess you could say, and maybe more
Yeah.
broadly than just the left, right? But like liberalism as a whole, it is it's the air we breathe, and then these more progressive communities like California and Colorado, like if you're trying to be a faithful, devout Catholic, there's this temptation to run somewhere that's more your flavor, right? But I think we can't all do that. Maybe some of us are called to do that, right? Like we're supposed there probably should be communities where it's really strong and well preserved and they're sort of sequestered, like almost like a neo monasticism with lay people or something. But then there also needs to be evangelistic communities who are learning how to live in the midst of it, right? And I think about like Daniel's situation in the Old Testament, living in Babel, and even being involved in the royal courts, but not succumbing to paganism and not succumbing to its influence, and then being able to impact it for the better. How do you approach that, right? Because you would say you're committed to LA and you want to live there and impact there. I feel the same way about where I live. Like there's a lot of things that are not, in terms of, you know, my faith and in terms of the way I live my life, there's a lot of things that are not agreeable happening around me, but I feel called to stay here, and it's hard to find. Um, yeah, like what's the modus operandi for someone to do that, and to do it well, and to not become like a complacent Catholic and then become like the world?
Yeah, well, I think that it's true. My school lost like 15 families. We're a very conservative, more traditional school in Los Angeles where I teach at right now. And I think our numbers were like 15 really good, solid families went to either South Carolina, went to Texas. And, I think there are a lot of reasons why people left. I think the politics was tough, the mask mandate, just frustrations with Gavin Newsom and the local DA. There were good, solid reasons to say this is not what I can't raise my family if we're not arresting crooks.
Right.
I can't raise my family in a place where like they shut down my church. They shut down my schools and stuff like that. So, and also on top of that, it's a very expensive state to live in. So there are good reasons why. I think that. I think there are advantages to having the more monastic communities. I think that in one sense, those of us that stay in a city like Los Angeles to kind of battle it out in a specific way, I think that there's an insight there, and some people are called to that. But I do think like, building communities in Texas, Catholic communities, or even like Steubenville, I think like tons of people, I have some friends that texted me, that they're moving to Steubenville, and that seems to be where everyone's going. There's a great advantage to that, and people call it a bubble, and like some people can't live within a bubble like that, but there is something that like a bubble like Steubenville can actually bring. It can give us a visible image of what our cities ought to look like, of they have a specific insight, they're able to see clearly and then speak to us. And, I'm sure that in Babylon there were communities. Jeremiah is frustrated because you have tons of Israelite or Jews that are living in Babylon that have totally forgotten that there is this Holy Land that's been promised to them, and they like don't want to go home. They don't want to return. And I think that the bubble type communities in like Steubenville are reminding us, while in the midst of Babylon, that like, hey, we have a specific calling, a promise, and like they shine a bright light on that. And I think that is valuable. So I think people, if they feel called to go to that, then you have those of us that are like, we I love that idea. And it's definitely not a bubble where I'm at, but I'm staying where I'm at to create the kingdom of God here. And there's a bit of sort of the natural, like, this is my home. When we live in the empire of the United States, which really is, it is like an empire, we forget that like the 50 states are like 50 nations, states are nations. And yes, we have this unique highway system, and we don't have to use passports, and we're all kind of like, we all live in one state, one empire. We also forget that California is sort of like my nation, my individual nation. That's how kind of the founders created it. The 50 states are supposed to have more sovereignty than what we're used to today. So, there's also the subsidiarian impulse of this is kind of where I'd like to stay. I'm not just going to abandon my home because, people were talking about leaving the United States of America if Trump became president or something like that. And it's like, okay, I mean, you can, but you don't feel any obligation or patriotism to stay. And, in this case, it's a bunch of liberals. It's like stay and like try to fight it. You're just going to leave because of one guy. You're going to leave California because of, Gavin Newsom. And I think the problem is like, we just kind of move from state to state until we find our community, which is, again, isn't that bad, but there is a loss of like loyalty to, okay, things are not as good, but like there does come a time where you do need to flee from the city of Jerusalem, as Jesus says, when the time comes, get out of there. But at the same time, you have to return, or you have to still try to build the kingdom of God there where you're at. So, I mean, and also too, like the traffic and the homeless,
the practical stuff. Yeah.
that doesn't bother me because also I grew up here, so
Mm-hmm.
I like
Mm-hmm.
sitting in traffic, and I don't mind the homeless on the streets, as much as obviously other people do. So
Yeah, one of the things I think about a lot in regards to this stuff is that we've sort of lost a philosophy of, and I guess you could say a theology of place, right? And
hmm
this is another way in which we're kind of swimming in the air of the American empire, is that we're used to non-places. We're used to airports and cafes that all look the same. And yeah, sort of this like blank slate idea of culture and worldview that you can just move to your preference, right? So in some sense, like I guess I've chosen to combat that of like my wife and I feel called to our community. We feel called to live here, and there's things that I love about it. Like for me, Colorado is home. It's where I grew up. There's lots of practical things we like the mountains and the outdoor recreation and the culture. And then there's things that just living here, especially as like a really committed Catholic, that's just I've fallen in love with like the agrarian nature of it and some of the heritage and stuff like that. And yeah, so I mean, just a personal, I guess, anecdote along those lines. I visited Steubenville for the first time in December, and I loved it. I had the best time, and I felt so edified because I was just surrounded by beautiful Catholic people who were so solid, and just everything was just like dripping with the faith. Right, everywhere I went, like the coffee shop, I overheard the barista talking about, Thomas Aquinas and his views on predestination with someone they were giving a coffee to. And I'm like, I would never hear that conversation in Montrose. And if I did, I'd probably know the people having it, right? And so I think you're exactly right. Like we need those pockets. And in a sense, for me, I wonder if it's not so that someone that's, almost like a missionary in one of these other communities can go there for renewal and respite, right? Like that's how I felt in Steubenville. I felt a lot of respite of just being surrounded by like-minded people who are fighting for the same things, and they get to live in, for me, I saw the future of what my community could be like if the Lord blesses our efforts here. But it is difficult, right? Because even though you have these attachments to a place that might be home, you have this love for this place. At least for me, the conflict does feel to be more apparent. Like, and maybe it's just that I'm growing up and I'm an adult now, but like when I was a kid, I don't feel like it was quite the same. Like there's a shift where maybe those what used to be internal and unspoken disagreements are now a little more on the surface, right? And at least it feels like to live a committed Catholic faith is going to be sort of making you, I guess, a pariah or an exile, and maybe not in like they're not kicking us out of the cities or persecuting us out loud yet, but there's a disconnect. Like if I'm at a marketing event with other companies and some of the values they're sharing and the things they're talking about are things that it's not just like, oh, well, I wouldn't say that. It's like things I diametrically oppose and disagree with foundationally, right? And so to live in the midst of that constantly and then try to work for its benefit, it is kind of exhausting, but at the same time, it's so important, right? Because if we don't do it, then who will? At least that's been like my call in my area. So I kind of wonder, is that similar for you? Do you feel a similar sort of tension and almost it almost is starting to feel like being a missionary, if that makes sense?
yeah, no, it totally is, and in a sense, that's always kind of been there.
Hmm.
But it's hard to judge because right now in the political atmosphere, things are even more like, okay, you have a disagreement at a marketing conference, and it just
Mhm.
seems like with everything else going on with President Biden declaring Sunday like
Oh
transgender,
man.
and it's like
Yeah.
okay, now that experience at the marketing thing is coupled with this other thing that seems like to be a war on Easter, or like why would you do
Hmm.
this on this very
Hmm.
special day? And it does feel like there is this total war. But I think the war is always there.
Hmm.
I think that the dark powers, one of the things, I studying under a guy named Tremper Longman, who really kicked off I think he had a huge influence on guys like Scott Hahn and N.T. Wright. Tremper Longman the third, who's an Old Testament scholar, he sort of kicked off like the
That's the
biblical
coolest
theology.
name.
Yeah, he kicked off the biblical theology movement with do I have his book somewhere? He kicked off the biblical theology movement with a book called God is a Warrior. and
Hmm.
he studied. I'm gonna lose my train of thought because I don't know where I was going. Oh, about the dark powers. Yeah, he kicked off the biblical theology sort of movement with studying the theme of the divine warrior in the Old Testament, which is a key theme, right? The very first thing that Israel, the very first name that Israel gives to God as a
Hmm.
nation is he's a warrior.
Hmm.
It with I think it's in Exodus 15 with the song at the sea, and that idea of the divine warrior, protecting Israel, is then like seems to be dropped in the New Testament, and
Hmm.
Tremper Longman sort of picks up. He says, no, it's not dropped. It's not
Hmm.
dropped. Actually, it's only intensified with Christ. Christ is the divine warrior, but the dark powers are now sort of the law is seen for what it is, which is sort of like Paul says, it's kind of revealing the depths of our slavery,
Hmm.
and that there is sort of like a Sauron behind, or yeah, that's right, that right, Lord of the Rings reference.
Hmm.
There is this dark power behind the human political figures,
Hmm.
and of course John draws this out with his atonement theology, uh, excuse me, in his gospel, where it seems to be, yeah, Satan seems to be there lurking, not too far in the distance, like
Hmm.
in the Passion of Christ that Mel Gibson did. Clearly Satan is his seed, his children are these Roman executioners,
Hmm.
and I think that it's always important to keep in mind that um that, as Scott Hahn said, like a lot of these people at the marketing conference, they're all victims of a war that's
Yes,
waging.
exactly. It's
Yeah,
the
they're all
spiritual
victims.
warfare, right? Our battle's not against flesh
Totally.
and blood. Yeah. Which
Yeah.
makes it feel more epic when you realize that in one way, but then it's also like harder because it's so easy just to make it like oh well, it's that person's a Democrat and I disagree with them or whatever it is, to make them the problem. But yeah, the more you realize that they're beholden to something that's leading them astray and controlling them, not to like totally take their agency from them, but to say that it's deeper than merely this surface level human thing. Yeah, sorry to cut you, just
No.
but
Yeah, no, I was just wrapping up, like that was
mhm,
it, which is
mhm,
that to keep in mind that Satan is our ultimate enemy. That's also
mhm,
another way. That's actually something that has helped me as well. With when you're dealing with thorny issues with people within the church, is to
mhm,
recognize that their our enemy really is Satan. He is the
right,
one that's causing all this, like you know disputes within families, disputes within the church. Like this is all caused by Satan, according
mhm,
to Jesus. So
mhm,
Jesus recognizes that Satan he can have an influence on Peter, right
mhm,
after Matthew 16:19. He can have an influence on Judas. He enters into Judas at that moment that he receives the Eucharist. So
mhm,
so Satan is behind everything, and of course the end of Paul's letter to the Ephesians is sort of the that all of that sort of summarized in, our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers in the heavenly
mhm,
places. And so that's just something to keep in mind too, is like, how do I win? There's this competition going on between me and Satan for this individual soul, and I'm addressing this topic. How do I use the natural and supernatural gifts that I to in order to win this match, this
mhm,
particular match within the
mhm,
larger game that is the cosmic warfare? And
mhm.
that's important to keep in mind when you're trying to win an ally rather than for the Lord, rather than trying to show an enemy that he's an enemy. It's like, okay,
Right. Yeah,
so
you're trying to make someone that's acting as an enemy realize that they're supposed to be a friend, like they're supposed to be within the covenant. And what like one way that I've found that's effective is trying to um uphold the good impulses they have in things they believe, and call them into full like Catholic fullness, right? So like if someone has an impulse to really speak out loudly about social justice, well, some of the particular topics that they might be choosing maybe aren't agreeable, and maybe their philosophy you would say is like misguided or wrong or whatever. But like that impulse is good and is Catholic, and we can draw it into a Catholic fullness like slowly as we get to know people and discuss with them. It's funny, particularly in the realm of Catholic social teaching. I've kind of run this experiment in like networking conversations, or just out grabbing a drink with colleagues from around town, and politics inevitably comes up. And for a long time I had really long hair, so I was like a perfect total liberal in disguise, and no one really knew what I thought about things. They just assumed that I was like probably very different than I am in terms of what I believe. But I could always have a conversation about the dignity of workers, or like the dignity of like a just wage providing for an entire family, like things straight from papal encyclicals, right? Or subsidiarity, that subsidiarity should be like one of the prime focuses of governance, where we're not overlording people with this power from above that's just but that they have agency and self governance insofar as is practical, and then you go to the higher level as necessary, right? The more that I talked with those principles, people were like, yeah, like, how could you disagree with that? It's like, well, I'm not going to tell you where I got it from, because then you might stop listening to me for now. But that's been helpful, just to view people. I mean, really just people that are lost, right? That are caught up in something in the same way that I am so often. Like I'll go through all sorts of moments where I'm realizing, wow, I'm caught up in this view of this thing, and it's not, I need to be liberated from it just as much on the other side of being a Catholic as it was before, right? I'm kind of always deepening my conversion. So, yeah, that's been helpful.
Yeah, totally. And having those
Yeah.
raw conversations with the Lord in prayer
Mm-hmm.
is really helpful too. Like just just bringing it, like having all these conversations with the Lord, like
Mm-hmm.
as if he's a friend, and talking to him about talking with him through these particular issues is helpful.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, man. That's something I think about a lot. Like we get crazy over here in Montrose. We have this amazing priest, and my wife and him, and I, and a lot of people in our parish are kind of going through a sort of parish renewal right now. And that's become what it's been like. Like we've really keyed in on the spiritual warfare aspect of it, and not like to overreach and just say everything's spiritual warfare, because you can go too far that direction as well. Where was I going with that? Man, I totally just lost my train of thought. But I think it was all that to say that having a more missional mindset has become a heartbeat of our parish, and like for me of my podcast. Like if it's not making people have deeper encounters with Jesus in a way that's just drawing them closer and leading to healing and leading to greater evangelistic fervor, and a deepening of the fruits of the church, and it's like, man, what am I doing? And I hope that it does that. It's actually funny, like a month and a half ago, I stopped posting as much, and a lot of that's because I was really wrestling with, and even at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking a lot about technology, because I'm thinking through like how do I engage with this as a Catholic without just completely submitting myself to it blindly like so many of us have done, but also without becoming a Luddite, right? And I've been really wrestling with that. And then I had a conversation with a viewer, because there was a week where I was like, this is all just a waste of time, and maybe I should stop doing it. And then I got an email, and I chatted with this guy who came into the church, and he's like, and I was listening to your podcast a lot, and it was so helpful. And it was like perfectly timed, right? Because God was saying, hey, like it's doing something, so just figure out how to not become, figure out how to do this in the midst of the world without becoming beholden to it or enslaved by it, right? Because with tech in particular, it's so easy for me to become enslaved by my tech and just be on my iPad all the time or whatever. And like I got a flip phone because I'm a weak man. I can't not be on my phone all the time if I have a smartphone, right? But at the same time, realizing there's a mission in that. If I can find freedom myself, then go help other people find it as well. Totally. I'm getting a little off track there. I don't know where I was going with that, but
no, that's good. I think you should keep. I think you should keep up. I'm loving your content, and I think, what an amazing. This is an amazing opportunity, right? Like, you can reach tons of people. I mean, it's amazing just to see how many people have come into the church through someone just like Michael Knowles, right? Or someone like Bishop Barron, or someone like, maybe it's one or two people that come in through your channel. And, I think of me because I was in part reverted through just some efforts on some people in the local Catholic community that saw me in the parish mass and at Mass and came up to me and invited me into the community, and I got, drawn in, and then I started reading more on Catholic theology, and
Mm-hmm.
even that one person that you can influence, Drew, on like your channel, like that, whoever that guy was,
Mm-hmm.
like he could go start a family, and that
Oh yeah.
family is going to be raised Catholic, and
Mm-hmm.
then they might have 4 or 5 kids. One of those kids becomes a priest, maybe two of them, maybe,
Right.
and then you've just changed like it. Just for that, it's worth
Mm-hmm.
having, being on YouTube and just
Mm-hmm.
reaching one person to, it's great. It's this ripple effect,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so
No, that's exactly right. That was kind of the realization, because I tend to be a little bit dramatic sometimes. I don't know if anyone who watches my channel has noticed, but I have a penchant for the like, I'm a literary guy, right? So, the
yeah.
English major, I like the really dramatic stuff. I like words that hit hard. But
Yeah, me
sometimes
too.
that's not
I'm
the
the same way.
best. That's not the best personality trait when it comes to your own walk. Yeah, I kind of want to go and talk a little bit about education before we
Yeah.
wrap up, because so it's you've helped start some schools. You're passionate about Catholic education, and this is in a way a selfish thing to talk about for me. So we have a local Catholic school here that I'm on the board of. So I'm always looking for, like, okay, someone who's done this and started schools that are successful. What did you do?
Yeah.
How did you do it? Right. But I guess more so, there's a lot of people that I talk to today, either online or offline, that and it's like a sad reality that even much Catholic education has sort of become Catholic in name only, and there's a lot of people who are afraid of even sending their kids to a Catholic school. And then, if you're a part of a Catholic school, you're trying to avoid that happening and be faithful, but also like not go bankrupt. And then at the same time, I know for me, it's like, this is so important because, a big part of my story is I went to a Catholic school before I ever became Catholic. Like, I grew up in a Catholic, a diocesan school.
I do remember that from one of your videos. Vaguely.
Yeah. And it didn't make me Catholic then, but like, I can see how some of those seeds were important later. So it's like, for me, I really love the idea of Catholic education, and I want to make it happen. Yeah, in Montrose, but also, like you said, like wherever we can. So I
Do you
guess
have is it a diocesan school?
the school I'm on the board of is not. It's independent.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's good.
yeah, which has been nice. But then you know how it goes. The struggle is, so we have no funding.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, I guess what is the heartbeat and the mission and the philosophy behind like true Catholic education? Not just here's what we're doing in public school and we talk about Jesus sometimes, but like, what makes it properly Catholic?
Well, I think that what makes it, I mean, it's an extension of Catholic families. That's what, this is why kind of my philosophy, I have an article I'm drafting, it'll probably be a video, or I'll submit it to Catholic World Report, is just saying, look, like in 100 years, the bishops won't be in control of the schools anymore. And it'll be the laity, and providentially or accidentally, the bishops are in charge of basically the institutions that form the lay vocation, rather than the laity being in charge of the institutions that form the lay vocation. And so it's interesting to see Catholic education right now, because the independent schools are clearly, the diocesan schools are closing, and the independent Catholic schools are increasing. And so we're seeing a complete reversal where in maybe even like the next 20 years, the bishops will not be, they will be granting these mandatums, or the, Canon 212, or no, which I can't remember which canon it is, where they can use Catholic in their name. But bishops are kind of resistant to it a little bit right now, because these independent schools are a threat to their existing diocesan schools, right? But over time, I think that it's probably a work of the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit seems to be handing over Catholic schools to the laity, and which makes sense. And here's why: because the school is just an extension of the family.
Beautiful.
And so the parents are the ones who should be running the school. And I think part of the frustration with Catholic families is they want their school to become more Catholic, but you have a superintendent or a pastor or a committee that is not really basically, you know, then it's like, so too bad. You have your kid here.
Mhm.
We're going to form them. And the parents are taking more of control of that. They're like, okay,
Mhm.
we'll just go start our own independent Catholic school. And then once we have 100 kids, then the bishop will have to recognize us, as Catholic or whatever. So, I think that whatever the answer to the question is, what is the role of the parents within the formation of their kids, is the answer to like a Catholic educational
Mm.
model, so
Mhm.
it seems to be the more fundamental question is, what is the role of what's the vocation of a Catholic parent, which is, of course,
Mhm.
to raise your kids in a way that will allow them to succeed in the vocation that God has them, that is calling them to, which is
Mhm.
either to work in the world, and to be called to a vocation, well, to have families themselves,
Mhm.
um, or to join the priesthood or religious life, something like that. So, um, but I mean, ultimately, Catholic education uh, also needs to potentially do a better job of giving spiritual resources to these kids, because
Hmm.
the kids are struggling. Like, I mean, like spiritual directors, frequent confession. There should be an opportunity for weekly confession for the students at schools. Um, they should have spiritual formation classes. You know, uh, So I think that the classical model is a big model right now, and just because it's like, hey, we're gonna go back to
Mhm.
reading ancient texts with Western texts. We're gonna go back and study Euclid rather than just jumping to modern geometry and how it's taught and
Mhm.
stuff like that. And all that's good because it cultivates a respect for tradition and the
Mhm.
West and the West's sources and all that. But ultimately, what makes a Catholic school is its dedication to Jesus, and
Hmm.
really, like, personnel is policy. So just more than just having the right mission statement and the right core values is are hiring people that love Jesus, and
Mhm.
that understand that Jesus is getting these students closer to Jesus is the most important thing.
Right.
They might not be the best writers, but loving our Lord is the most important thing.
Mhm.
They should be good at writing and reading and all that, but they're not competitive. But it often can be competitive. Um, it often can compete with Christ and the
Hmm.
opportunities that we give them to succeed. So I also think that Catholic education is going to have to make a huge decision soon about what to do with technology,
Yeah.
because of the challenge that is um, the tuition on families.
Mhm.
It's too expensive, and then as a board member, like, I. I have to pay my teachers. My
Mhm.
teachers have families, and how do I keep the costs low for these parents, but also pay the families? And
Mhm.
and then it talks about it, fundraising is a challenge and all that. So
Mhm.
but you have to do all that within your core values. What are you not? If low tuition is a core value, and you don't have as a core value paying competitive salaries, then you're gonna be willing to lose a potentially good teacher because of a salary in order to keep the costs low.
Right.
So knowing up front as a board member, what are your core values? What are you not gonna budge on?
Mhm.
Therefore, what are you willing to budge on when it's in competition with this other thing we call the core value? So
Yeah. No, that's all good stuff. It is tough, right? Because like at our school, we never want to turn someone away because they can't afford it. And we also want like
yeah,
good Catholic teachers who are qualified. And then you hit this point where you're like, all right, well, we want to accept everyone, and we want to pay teachers, and we want to have them all. It's like, so you almost need like a miracle somehow. And it seems like we get one every year. Like, it truly, in our experience, has been awesome. We have a lot of supporters and a lot of parents and a lot of families who, I mean, every year just come through. Um, And then at the same time, yeah, there's even challenges with like I know one thing is we're starting to see, and I'm wondering if you'd have experience with this as well. We're starting to see people come to our school, and this is great. Having been the non-Catholic at the Catholic school who later became Catholic, I never want to say no to this, but we're getting a lot of non-Catholics coming just because it's not woke, right? Or just because it's
Yeah.
like vaguely Christian in their mind in enough of a sense that it's like we're explicitly Catholic, and so we have some Christians who come like maybe like high church Anglicans or like Methodists or whatever who aren't like totally bugged out by the fact that it's Catholic, or even just like non-Christian families that are just like, yeah, the public school system's a joke right now. This place seems safe. And there's like a balance, right, between we don't want to say no to those kids either because we want them to have a good education and it's a great evangelistic opportunity in a sense. And at the same
Totally.
time, like if like 80% of our students were non-Catholic, well then we start to lose that Catholic culture, right? So there's kind of a balance there. Have you guys seen some of that stuff where you're getting a lot of non-Catholics that are coming
Yeah.
just because of the good education? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the woke. Well, in California, I think we're at like about 100,000. It jumped up like 40%. I think the number was between 700 or 800,000 homeschooling families.
Oh wow.
In or students. Sorry, students.
Wow.
In California, and so homeschooling is a huge, huge thing out here in California. A lot of Catholic families are just homeschooling because there are a lot of good resources online and just through charter schools as well. Um, when the pandemic happened and all of these different waves of woke ideology came flooding through the schools,
Mm-hmm.
especially in Los Angeles, right? California is like pretty notorious for this. Then a lot of families reached out to us, but we're upfront with them. Like, we're a Catholic school. We'll be actively trying to evangelize your kid. Like, just as the same way that, the again, this goes back to worldview, the Heidi Presbilla point was like,
Mm-hmm.
they have a worldview. They're pushing that worldview
Mm-hmm.
in the public schools. And we have our worldview and we are pushing that worldview. And that's
Right.
okay. It's like, it's like, I think sometimes we get mad. It's like, well, this is their worldview. And if you want to change the public school and get them out, there is no neutral ground. So this is why I think that the
Yeah.
wokeness has really revealed that either you're going to get an Islamic state, you're going to get a Catholic state, or you're going to get a woke state. But there
Mm-hmm.
is no neutrality, and we've
Right.
pretended like there is. And so part of my channel is pushing Catholics to realize, like, we need to desire the
Mm-hmm.
state should, because Christ is king, favor Catholic education. I mean, Catholic
Mm-hmm.
education should be 100% free. And now you can make the argument, as the church has, that a major justice has happened in which Catholic education is not free, but it should be,
Mm-hmm.
because we're actually doing a better job at educating. We're providing this common good, and yet
Mm-hmm.
Catholic parents are having to pay for it,
Mm-hmm.
and then also pay their tax dollars to pay for other kids to go to school. So
Right.
that's a whole other issue. And there are some states like Oklahoma that are pushing back and saying this is discrimination. We're teaching
Mm-hmm.
them math, we're teaching them English, we're teaching them science. This is a common good that we're providing, and yet you guys are discriminating against us because we're Catholic. So
Mm-hmm.
there are arguments that are kind of making their way up the Supreme Court, it seems, over this. And the charter school movement, a lot of people are actually looking for like the savings accounts, I think, or the voucher programs, where you give each student gets $2,500 a semester, and they can
Mm-hmm.
use that towards tuition at their Catholic school.
Mm-hmm.
And that would save from discriminating against Catholic schools. And then you allow the parents, when they donate, to actually their dollar goes further, right?
Hmm.
To support the school. So it's tough right now because we have states that are discriminating against us as a religious Catholic school. And so you're
Mm-hmm.
having the fundraising piece is tough.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a whole other issue.
Right. I love what you said about there is no neutral though, right? Because like there truly isn't. And I mean, just to kind of go back to that whole conversation for a minute, we the as long as we have, we being most Americans, pretended that or believe that it's neutral, the people maybe on the secular side who knew it wasn't have just been kind of covertly gaining ground, right? Um,
Yeah.
And now it's as though, like, I always think of it as though, like when evil thinks it's about to win, that's when it overplays its hand. It gets really loud and bombastic. And, God likes to confound the wicked by their own devices. Like, there's all these biblical motifs, and I really do think they play out. But it's like, I think a lot of people in the past 5 years, past 3 years, past 10 years maybe have kind of gone, whoa, what's happening? What happened? But if you look at it historically, it's like maybe this has been happening for at least 100, maybe 300, maybe 500 years, where these sort of movements have been kind of covertly. I don't want to say it in like a conspiratorial way, like there's like like men in a dark room somewhere, but like, like the secular forces of the world have not been pretending that's neutral, and that's why they've been gaining ground, right? Like, I think about even my own town. There's people with a very clear ideology and a very clear mission to evangelize that ideology, slowly taking up board seats on libraries and in the county and things like that. And then the rest of us have just been like, oh yeah, it's neutral, it's America, it's fine. And then you wake up and go, uh-oh, you're kind of in new territory, right? And I think there's going to be hopefully a healthy and I guess I would say hopefully a healthy reaction to it, not one that creates like open conflict or anything, but one that is like, hey, if we think our faith is true, which it is, then we should be just as adamant about trying to, like you said, make it to where Catholic education is prominent, and not just prominent, but like the default option for as many people as possible. Because if we think what we have is true, if we think that our faith is the truth of God revealed, then it's almost selfish to like not be bold with that and not be trying to share it with as many people and as many kids as in schools, in parishes, and just neighbors and friends as possible, right? But because it's been neutral, I think people have grown complacent in that, right? There's this sense of like, oh, well, they'll let them choose for themselves or whatever, which there's a whole underlying philosophy behind that, and you've already kind of lost, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and that's democracy, and I think liberals are the classical liberalism, like I think that the shouting democracy, 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 you realize that, well, what happens if a country or a state in the union votes to put in their constitution, Article 1, that Jesus Christ is king and the official religion of the state of whatever is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And they're like, well, that's not democracy. That's not democracy. It was like, well, what if they voted for it though?
Right.
And then and see, that's why I think the criterion is Pontius Pilate is right. Like the main criteria is truth. Like what is true? And
what is true?
You look at California. I mean, California put in its constitution, they constitutionalized the slaughter of these innocent children in the womb. And of course they did. Like, Catholics are like, they can't do that. I was like, well, of course they have a worldview. They have a worldview in which the person is not made in the image and likeness of God, and in the womb, and I think a lot of Western values are receding throughout the world. A lot of, China's like, hey, look, we don't actually have this view that the person is made in the image and likeness of God. That's sort of your thing, not our thing. And so I think in the United States too, it's like, look, you believe that the child in the womb is made in the image and likeness of God, but we don't. And it's like, okay, cool. So who's actually going to win the battle here? Someone has to win the battle. Right. And I think Catholics sometimes are just like, well, can't we just continue to keep things neutral? And it's like, and I think a lot of Catholics are waking up and they're realizing, oh, we can't. It's like, no, we can't. And actually we have millions upon millions of little children dead precisely because us Catholics thought that we could just, get along and just say, oh, they don't have a worldview, right? Because the separation, what they're asking us to do is separate church and state, which is really a separation of worldview and state. That's the best way to put it. So stop using that language of like church and state. Just say worldview and state. And then when you put it that way, you realize, well, everybody has a worldview. These Democrats, liberals have a worldview. The Christian nationalists have a worldview. Everyone has a worldview. Putin has a worldview. Islam, the Islamic states in the Middle East have a worldview, and that's what took American
Mm-hmm.
politicians, especially the Democrats, to realize so long. Like, why do they keep? Why do they have? Why are they acting in this way? It's like because they have a worldview that you think
Mm-hmm.
people can live without when they
Mm-hmm.
come to the public square. When in fact, you are establishing this trans visibility day because you have a worldview. And
Right.
I think that's the challenge. And there's one group that's sort of sitting on the sidelines like, hey, we're willing to throw up our worldview and kind of put it to the side. Christ is only king of our hearts and not of societies, which is contrary to what the
Yikes.
church teaches.
Yeah.
And I think Catholics are now finally, I've been sounding this for a while, but I think Catholics are now kind of getting to a point where it's like, oh, actually, we might have to sanctify society as
Right.
well, not just individual souls.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And it's one of those things where like the really sad part about it too is in this sort of like neutral America myth, people have totally bought into the very not neutral idea that your faith is entirely personal and has no place in the public sphere, which means that most Catholics, and well, that's too general, many Catholics aren't even aware of the rich treasures of church teaching in the realms of like social teaching and its views on, the political realm throughout the ages and all that. Like, we're not even aware of the mound of gold that we're sitting on, many of us, right? And for me, converting to Catholicism, I had to learn a lot of that stuff because, like, the Catholic Church has a very strong stance on contraception that most Protestants don't. So, like, that's a big ticket issue for any convert, really, because you're like, wait a minute, they're saying what? And so I had to learn all these things. But then I started to realize that it's like, oh, this is exactly right. And it's like, just to go to the biblical narrative, this is God's vision for humanity. And I know Scott Hahn talks a lot about this. Like, when you get worship right, everything is downstream from cultists. There's the worship, then there's the culture around the worship, and then there's the politicos, then there's the organization of the state from that. And like it can't be any other way. And so if there's a state that's organizing itself different, well then their worship at the pentultimate source of whatever they're worshiping is different, right? And so we can't expect to convert people to Catholicism without it trickling down ultimately into building that. But I think this is an idea I've been toying around with. I'd love to hear your thoughts on. I also think we can't do it in reverse. I don't think that we could just co-opt power and then say there was like some sort of situation where tomorrow there's someone basically mandating legally that America's a Catholic state. I don't think it would work, right? Because if people internally aren't worshiping correctly, external obedience, like the law is a teacher and it will work to some extent maybe down the line, but I don't know that like you could just legally mandate Catholicism and then have it actually turn people's hearts towards Christ, right? It only goes the one way. And I think this idea plays out even in terms of talking about, within the church, I want to be careful how I say this because I want all of these things, but it's not as though we can just rebuild beautiful high altars with altar rails and expect that to fix the catechesis and the interior problem with a lot of the people in the pews, right? And I say that as someone that, like, in my parish, I want altar rails and really traditional, beautiful art everywhere. But it's like those things developed out of a personal conversion and out of an interior experience that necessarily orients everything, from the top down, from God to neighbor, from experience with the divine to the worship community. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Like, is that
totally? Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think that's the tension. That it works one way. Like but I think that I think it's the problem with the exiles is that they believed Yahweh was the one true God, and they had a personal relationship, if you want to put it that way, with Yahweh.
Sure.
But they didn't want to return to Jerusalem and build the city that was supposed to be the witness to the other nations around the world. And so I think that just having individual hearts doesn't mean like you could have a 90% Catholic devout Catholics in the United States. It doesn't mean that they're gonna, would they vote to overturn some of these things? It's like, well, you'd hope they would,
right?
But would they vote to make Christ the king of the constitutions? It's like, well, I mean, I don't know. I think Jeremiah's frustration clearly is that they have this personal relationship, but they've failed to realize that their vocation is to sanctify the nations, and
Right.
to do that
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
rebuilding the temple, returning home to the land that God has promised. At the same time, you're right that you can clearly see that in Christendom, Pope Pius crowns Napoleon. Napoleon has no love for our Lord.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't say that, but like, he's not really interested in the church. I mean, he has
Mm-hmm.
this, or Christ. And you see this with bishops throughout the Middle Ages. You see this
Mm-hmm.
with the laity. We get World War I, World War II because, in a large measure, these Catholic princes, aren't waking up and doing 20 minutes of mental prayer and doing
Mm-hmm.
examination of consciences at night and
Yep.
fulfilling their Christian obligation
Mm-hmm.
to sanctify the temporal order. So it's not automatic because you need the Spirit. And so this is where the bishops and the priests come in. Like sacramental grace, I talk about often the sacramental reign of Christ the King,
Mm.
that it will express itself in constitutions, in world governments, but it's primarily through the sending of the Spirit, because the Spirit is the key here. The
Mm-hmm.
Spirit, which sanctifies our hearts, then moves us to go and sanctify the larger society. But I do think that,
Mm-hmm.
to push back a little bit, I
Mm-hmm.
I've thought a lot about like just the fact of Constantine and Theodosius. Like, yeah, maybe making Catholicism the official religion didn't, it didn't sanctify. It didn't, maybe, I don't know how many hearts it changed, but it
Sure.
clearly masses converted to Catholicism, and
Right. Right.
and
Right.
and it was, I mean, we're talking about 1,500 years of people receiving the
Mm-hmm.
sacraments, receiving the grace, because of this conversion from the top. Something happened in the Constitution, in the ruler, and then everyone saw it. And I actually
Mm-hmm.
think that is the paradigm given to us with Solomon and David, because
Okay. Yeah.
so with the giving of wisdom, see, Solomon is the perfect lay. He's a lay person, and you see that the wisdom literature is the means by which evangelization occurs.
Mm-hmm.
So the nations are brought into worship Yahweh, like the Queen of the South. Jesus talks about, hey, look, the Queen of the South is going to come and judge you guys because she
Mm-hmm.
converted at the wisdom of Solomon, but I myself have wisdom far greater than Solomon, and
Mm-hmm.
you guys aren't converting. And I think that when lay people are in positions of power, and that's not a bad word, right?
Mm-hmm.
Earthly power is good. It's not sufficient. But when coupled with the Spirit giving us wisdom to govern with God's wisdom, through the Spirit working through us, governing the order wisely, that
Mm-hmm.
does send a message to the Queen of the South and to the other nations like China, like other nations across the world, that like there's a wisdom here that they have access to, that they claim is given to them by wisdom himself, Jesus Christ. And that is
Mm-hmm.
a major form of evangelization. Wisdom dwelling in the temple in the form of Torah, but Jesus is now the fulfillment of Torah. He is wisdom. And so
Hmm.
when the laity are united with the Spirit governing the world, there should be, even though it's not always the case, there should be major evangelization happening. So I think that it can work from the top down, but obviously, if you have a lay person whose heart is not cut by the Spirit, then you
Mm-hmm.
end up with Napoleon, and then you end up with world wars, and then you end up with
Right.
millions dead.
Yeah. No, that's an important clarification. And I think what I'm getting at is more that sometimes we can get our goals mixed up, where maybe we want the fruit of Christendom without the interior component, and then it would just be exterior, right? It would just be like a whitewashed tomb. Like, I think we can sometimes want the exterior and not sufficiently desire the interior change. And then there are
Totally.
certain things
Yeah.
that I think specifically I'm getting at, like developments around maybe the liturgy or even Catholic social teaching, where those wouldn't have happened without, 300 years of martyrdom and then legal Christendom. And
Yeah.
without that intense, love of the saints and love of the martyrs. Um, I like like a specific example that I know someone in the comments is probably going to rip me for, but like, there's evidence that in the earliest church, people did receive communion on the hand, and then it develops into on the tongue, which I prefer and think is better for a lot of reasons. But it's like, I think in some ways things have to go in that order, right? Where the reason it develops is because out of great love for the sacrament and reverence, then you say this is a better way to do it, right? So, and I wonder sometimes if we're not trying to reverse those of say, well, we should do it this way, and then they'll believe the Eucharist, and that works in a lot of cases. I agree that that works, but then like I'm just thinking in terms of broader evangelism, I don't know that I'll be able to convince my secular liberal friend that, you know, communion is real and he should receive on the tongue. But if I can convince him that Jesus is real and then that Jesus is present in the Eucharist on his own, he'll probably be like, I'm not going to put that in my hand, you know, if he's truly on fire, right? Does that so like the development of as you fall in love with Christ. And so I almost kind of wonder, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I almost wonder if, and I think this is true in many ways, we're entering into the first century again, narratively, maybe not like physically, like they're not, you know, burning us as lamps on the steps of Nero's palace, not yet at least, but like narratively, there's a lot of things in the world that are, to me, eerily similar to the first century in terms of, you know, the Western Empire, in terms of like gender ideology, like some of that surfaced in the Roman Empire, in terms of, I guess you could say religious tolerance, but really just like, you know, pagans, oh, what's another god to add to the mix? And then it's becoming more uncomfortable to be Christian. And so I kind of wonder if like, instead of just dialing back the time dial to the 1500s or to the 1300s or the 1100s, we almost have to well, it is like, right, the new evangelism. We have to re-evangelize the world almost as if from the beginning. And I don't want to overstate that and make it seem like we're literally starting as though Christendom had never happened. But in a lot of ways, it seems like this new thing is emerging. And I almost wonder if in ways we kind of have to start over. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Hopefully it's coming across.
It's sort of the from Christendom to apostolic mission, sort of, we're back.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like what worked in the Middle Ages is not going to work in this particular moment.
Yeah. But I think the end goal is Christendom. Like, I do think that, like, yeah, like, I think I'm planning to write a book. I haven't announced it or anything yet, but this will be my announcement. But like, writing a book called From Apostolic Mission to Christendom. Because I actually think, yeah, sure, we're in an apostolic age, but our goal is Christ's lordship, his kingship over the nations of the world. So I think that the message from the very beginning is always Jesus Kyrios. That's what it is. You know, and this Easter Monday, we should remind ourselves that, you know, my Bible's over there, but in Matthew 28:18, Jesus comes to his disciples, and what's the first thing he says? All authority on earth has been given to me. That's the challenge. That is the Easter message. It's a political message that, I mean, you could easily do what Christians have seemingly been doing for the last couple decades, which is saying, well, what he means by all authority on earth is given to him, he means like all moral or spiritual authority. But of course, he didn't qualify that. So we have to wrestle with, what does he mean by earthly authority? And the very fact that they followed that up with a proclamation that Jesus is Lord, Jesus Kyrios, is, as Bishop Barron's getting at, it's kind of politically subversive, saying, you know, Jesus really is the Lord of the world. So if we're going to call that Christendom, that's fine. Christendom, of course, is not a word that's used in the thing we call the Bible, but it's the kingdom of Christ is what Christendom's all about. It's what the story of the Bible's all about, which is that it's about God becoming king, an N.T. Wright book, right? God becoming king, and that is, and he does that through, remember, the Paschal mystery actually isn't over. A lot of people think it's over now that Easter's happened. Paschal mystery is not climaxed with its greatest feast in the church, which is the Ascension, which we'll celebrate the Ascension, and everyone will forget. They'll be like, oh yeah, that thing happened. It's like, look, the whole point of the Passion was not merely to be resurrected. The whole point of the resurrection was so that he could sit at the right hand of the Father in fulfillment of Daniel 7, in fulfillment of the Genesis 12 promises, as the new Adam, in fulfillment of the Genesis 1 and 2 vocation of the human race to rule the world on God's behalf. And he does that through the sending of the Spirit to the bishops, and also then to the laity that are meant to, you know, rule the world on his behalf. I think that's what we have to keep in mind, and and try to figure out ways to bring Christ as Lord. But going back to your main point, I agree that if you're not making Christ your Lord in the first 20 minutes of your day through mental prayer and through
Mm-hmm.
conversation with our Lord, like, I mean, you're just opening it up for scandal to take place when you do get a
Right.
position of power, and then you cheat someone, or you just create scandal because you're not,
Mm-hmm.
you have no love for our Lord. You're in it for yourself. And that's the risk. But it was a risk that Paul was willing to take. He
Mm-hmm.
knew everything that was happening in Corinth. He knew that Demas, one of his best friends, had left him for worldly pursuits. He knew all the scandals, and he still went and said, Jesus is Lord, and I speak on his behalf. And Peter
Mm-hmm.
does too, and all that.
Mm-hmm. I do think we need to reclaim that boldness too, and in a way, it's like it's ridding ourselves of like the lie of neutrality that we've been talking about so much in this conversation, right? Because I mean, the early Christians were so. I mean, just the statement, yeah, Jesus is Lord, is scandalous in a Roman context and in a Jewish context, right? Paul says as much, but they even did things that were, I mean, it wasn't like they were asking for governmental permits to start orphanages and hospitals and schools. They were just doing that and putting the Roman government to shame, right? They were sending people to the sickest of the sick, to leper colonies, and they were like rescuing children that were abandoned and all these things. And they weren't. And I'm not saying that we all just need to become like dissidents necessarily, but like there's a sense in which it becomes appropriate at some level, right? If the earthly authority is tyrannical and evil and completely reprehensible to what is good and true and beautiful, and no one is doing it, it's like, well, you don't necessarily wait for the permit to start the pro-life clinic. Maybe you just start making those connections and doing that work in an unofficial capacity, right? Now this video is going to be delisted, but like that level of just that comes from confidence in the true lordship of Christ in every arena, right? This is funny coming into the church as a former Protestant, because in early 1900s there's this debate in the Protestant world of the lordship salvation and the social gospel. Like, you had a lot of fundamentalists saying it's just about Jesus being Lord of your heart, and you got to believe in the gospel, and bring people the gospel. It doesn't matter if they don't have shoes. And that was oppositional reaction to mainline denominations saying, Jesus just wants us to do nice things for people, so we'll bring shoes to the orphan, but they don't need to know that he's, resurrected or anything. That would be cultural imposition or all sorts of things. So they almost like opposed those two things, as though doing charitable things was opposed to preaching the gospel. Like, that was a Protestant, and it still is. Like, I remember growing up in churches saying, it's no good to bring someone food if you don't bring them Jesus. And like, there's like dichotomy, but in Catholicism, it's like one and the same. There is, because Jesus is Lord, we'll sacrifice our own lives for the sake of the poor, right? And like, they're the treasure of the church, which is so much more cohesive and efficacious if we can remember that. Like, Jesus is truly Lord, Christ is the King, and that's irrespective of any earthly authority. And therefore, it's our job to make that reign a reality within our sphere of influence, and then ultimately, like you said, towards everything on earth and under the earth being subjected to his feet.
And keeping in mind that the fight is against flesh and blood, or is not against flesh and blood, will also remind us that the way Christ reigns is not merely through positions of political power, but through like Mother Teresa, right? Mother Teresa brought about the reign of Christ, because Satan's reign involves sickness, death, isolation, obviously sin, but all of the sickness and disease and death, that's all signs of the reign of Satan. And so when we go out and feed a homeless person, when we comfort someone in need, someone who's despairing, like we are like, we're not a congressman or a senator that's putting forth a decree that's going to make the subsidiary principle more realistic or something like that. But those are acts of war against Satan's kingdom to feed the poor. And that's really, it's not, again, when you feed a poor person, hand them a holy card and say, look, I'm praying for you, they know. I mean, the poor people in LA, the homeless people in LA know that look, the chances that you're a Catholic or Christian, you know, when you're giving me food, like they know. That's why they
Pretty
always say
high,
God
yeah.
bless, right? Because they know
Mm-hmm.
like these are the ones that are sort of going to war against
Mm-hmm.
Satan, and it's not as if they're possessed, but Satan again brings sickness, disease, death, isolation, division, and whenever we work toward that by feeding the poor, by giving money to you know, a friend in need, sitting down with a conversation with someone who is struggling and suffering, like those are all
Hmm.
acts of war against the dark
Hmm.
powers. And this is what
That's so metal.
um what
I said that's so metal. Like
yeah,
almsgiving is an act of war against the devil. That's epic. That's like
yeah,
that's
yeah.
this is what we should tell young kids in the church, that like when you're doing good works, it's an act of warfare against the devil. That's way cooler than like the sort of soft, squishy love we talk about in our culture so much.
Oh, totally. And one of you know, I picked this up early because of, oh, man, I wish I had the book by Tremper Longman that I was referring to earlier, which he says, look, Jesus is not, he's not going up against he's not going up against uh Pilate per se. Like he's not like in the Chosen. Well, that's a tangent, but Jesus is actually the fulfillment of the divine warrior promised. Like the divine warrior
Hmm.
was going to come, but Tremper Longman shows that the um in the Gospels, Jesus is actually, when he's healing, when he's forgiving sins, he actually is the divine warrior, but
Mm.
directed at the source of the evil, which is
Mm.
Satan. So you have to have like a spiritual apocalyptic worldview in
Yeah.
which cosmic warfare is happening in the heavens. So this is actually to actually give the full thing of what Jesus says in Matthew 28. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth. So that means that Satan has been dethroned. This is also an atonement model. The atonement
Mm-hmm.
theology is
Mm-hmm.
actually really important for this. That's what I'm working. That's what I spend a lot of my time working on. Is
Hmm.
that the Christus Victor model, the ransom model of the church fathers? Clearly, they understood that what happens with the death and resurrection of Jesus is the dethronement of Satan
Mm-hmm.
and the enthronement of the new Adam, Jesus at God's right hand. This is why Jesus comes back and says, all authority on in heaven, and therefore, because in heaven, not, it doesn't mean because in heaven, therefore not on earth. Precisely because Satan has been
Right.
dethroned, on earth, the authority's now been handed over to those who have received the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the two ages, the two worldviews colliding between those who govern God's good world in an evil way in union with Satan,
Mm-hmm.
and those who are pierced by the Spirit to govern it in God's wise and good and healthy and loving way.
Mm.
And and so going back to what I was saying, I can't remember actually the point that what was I saying?
Well, I don't know if this is
Oh
exactly
yeah, yeah,
where you
yeah.
were going to
No,
go with it. Yeah.
about like Jesus dethroning
Mm-hmm.
Satan. So like when he is healing the man with the withered hand, when he's raising people from the dead,
Mm-hmm.
you know, he's pointing toward the greater spiritual reality, right? The
Mm-hmm.
healings, like Thomas Aquinas says, the physical healings point to the sacraments, right? In the
Mm-hmm.
case with, you know, what is it harder to say get up and walk, or is it to say your sins are forgiven? And of
Mm-hmm.
course, he says, well, the whole point of me saying rise and walk is so that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins.
Mm-hmm.
And the forgiveness of sins is intimately tied with the release from captivity to the powers, to the dark powers,
Right.
you know, the devil. And so the spiritual battle is like, look, we bring about Christ's reign on earth when we feed the poor,
Mm-hmm.
not when we run away and go to Texas to create a bubble community of like-minded Catholics. It's like, no, this is a huge opportunity for those who live in LA to do the most damage to Satan, not
Mm-hmm.
to go and do something else.
No, I think that's exactly right. And while you were on that point, all I can think of is, I spent a lot of time after college and then towards the end of my theology degree in my undergrad, researching like the rabbinical writings and like the Talmud and stuff. And there was this expectation that the Messiah would sack Rome, basically, right? And like
Yeah.
dethrone. Yeah. And Jesus did that. Like I remember having this realization in the church fathers. He did it, but like he told Peter, we're not going to do it with the sword. Like stop cutting that guy's ear off. But we converted Rome. And so like when Paul and Peter found the church in Rome, that is an act of oppositional warfare, right? To the
Thank
devil.
you.
And then for the Roman church to be the seat of the successor of Peter on the Vatican Hill, which opposes the seven hills of Rome's like pagan power, is like it's the most metal thing ever, right? I was just in Rome recently, and because that's like the Protestant conspiracy is like, well, Vatican Hill, it's one of the seven hills of Rome. It's like actually it's not. It's on the opposite side of the river, which is way cooler because like there's this whole Roman myth of like these seven hills are where our power comes from, and for us to take the graves of Christians on the hill outside of like the Roman seat of power and make that the central seat of the church is like a fulfillment of that messianic desire that the Messiah would conquer Rome and make it, you know, nothing before all of Israel. Well, if the church inherits the promises of Israel, I don't know if that's the best way to phrase that, but then like that's the
Yeah.
seat of our power. It's a complete toppling of that empire, just like they expected, but not in the way they expected, right? Oh, you know what? I lost your mic there.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there we go.
Um, yeah. I'm just hearing that echo again, so I'm
Oh, sure.
just muting myself right now. But the yes, that's exactly right. I actually have a response to Lila Rose, something Lila Rose said on Twitter, which was that look, like Christ did not come to establish a political reign. And it's like I totally get where Lila's going with that, but like I think everything you said is what's missing. Like that could be the key thing that's missing in the church, which is like, look, he didn't not fulfill all the promises. You know, I was talking about The Chosen because in like season 1, episode like 2 or 3, Jonathan Rumi, you know, playing Jesus, you know, is teaching the kids. I don't know if you watched The Chosen, but he's teaching the kids, and then one of the kids is like, well, Rabbi so and so says that that the Messiah is supposed to be a political military leader,
Mm-hmm.
and they have Jonathan Rumi, they have Jesus say, well, sometimes, you know, bright men say silly things, and but is there a verse in the Old Testament where it says that? And then he kind of just like, yeah, your rabbi's wrong. It's like, no. Writers of the Chosen script, everyone else, listen, almost every single prophecy of the Messiah is that he's a political and military leader.
Mm-hmm.
Like they just totally missed that. It's not like having Jesus say, well, is there even one text? It's like, no. All of them say that. The problem, that's the challenge. The problem is, and this is where I think Tremper Longman's book is in, is like the problem is that the political reign is going to come about in another means, right? It's going to come through the enthronement on the cross, through suffering and love. But that does not mean that Constantine should not do the thing that he did, or Theodosius do the thing that he did, or
and
other states and nations. So it doesn't mean that. It just means that the cross always establishes the kingdom, right? Our union with suffering.
Right. I think I'm getting a little bit of a connection issue with your video feed, but I still hear your audio. No, I think that's exactly right. And like one thing, so what I was thinking of towards the end of what you were saying is,
Drew, are you there?
Yeah. Can you still hear me? Oh, here, I'll just pause for a second. All right. We had a bit of a technical glitch, but we're back. What I was going to say too is I think of Saul and David, right? So I think of the differences in their kingship. You know, a lot of people, I think, get confused when it says, you know, you should not have a king like Saul. That's not God saying you shouldn't have a king, because in Deuteronomy 17, he says you're going to have a king that I choose for you, but he doesn't want a king like the nations, right? One who's like the powers of the world. He wants a king like David, a man after his own heart, and ultimately a king like Christ. So it's not that the Old Testament people shouldn't have had a king. It's that it should be the king God chooses, which is ultimately the Messiah, which is, explicitly political. So I think that was a big turning point for me. Is like, well, if Jesus is the Messiah, then there has to be this imperative of kingship in God's plans. It's not just like an accidental, well, they chose a king, so we'll work with that. this was the plan all along, right? And of course, it extends beyond ultimately Israel. We see in the New Covenant, and then to the whole world in Christ. And then that the church is where it becomes universal, right? Because now you don't just have a king of a particular people in a particular land and a queen in a sense too. Now you have a king and a queen with Mary of the whole universe, right? So it becomes truly universal, truly Catholic in that sense. Anyways, that's
Yeah.
what I was thinking, kind of in response to what you were saying before the internet outage.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Yeah, I love that. I love that. So I think the political remains, because you can serve, you can help Mother Teresa, you can help, um, uh, you can govern God's world in a very unique and important way if you're in a position of power. But that also comes with temptations, just as feeding the poor comes with the temptation for pride. So it's a battle. It's not perfect yet, but in terms of who ought to be ruling the world, it seems to be those who have been engrossed by and gripped by the Spirit.
That's good. I feel like we could talk for hours, and I feel like there's
Yeah.
multiple conversations I now want to have with you after talking with you here. But we're coming up on the 2 hour mark, and I know you and I both have other things we need to get to today, so we'll probably wrap up there. Just I guess before that, do you have any final thoughts on kind of the stuff we've been discussing?
No, not really. I mean, I look forward
Okay.
to coming back. This was actually a really fun conversation, so I look forward to coming back on or having you on my channel. That would be fun.
Yeah, for sure.
And yeah, no, just keep up the good work with the school there. That's one way that you can bring about the reign of Christ the King. Educating kids and thanks for having me on. And this has been
Mhm.
really a joy. I love that. I love your channel. Love your content. So keep up the good work and yeah, I'll be praying for you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and likewise. Where can people connect with you and what you're up to and follow you if you want to plug maybe something you're up to in the near future?
Yeah, so you can go to my channel, Chris Plance YouTube channel. And I'm on Twitter at CG Plans, and that's kind of, you can also go to my website. I have articles. I also write a little bit if I'm not, I kind of take a lot of my articles now and just turn them into videos. So I haven't been publishing as much, but if they want to go to chrisplants.com, they can go there. They can also email me through the site if they want to if they want to reach out and ask a question or get in touch or anything like that. So
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks so much for coming on the channel. I also really enjoyed this conversation. And yeah, there's definitely lots more to talk about. So, we can bounce between each other's channels. And something that we're up to over at my channel pretty soon is I have a couple interviews coming up soon. I probably won't announce the specifics of them, but this weekend, well, yeah, I'll post this in time. This weekend, we're actually going to do a cigar review. I have a box of the Pints with Aquinas cigars coming to me. So we'll do a live stream Sunday at 1 p.m. Mountain Time, everybody. And if you want to come hang out and watch us smoke some cigars, do that. It'll be fun. So that's the most immediate thing. And then I've been trying to plug at the very end. I am going to the Eucharistic Congress, everybody. So if you're going to be there, let me know in the comments, and we'll try to meet up with some of the viewers, and we'll be doing some interviews out there. So make sure you stay tuned for that. And yeah, go subscribe to Chris's channel. Like I said at the beginning, I've been really enjoying his content, and there's a lot of valuable stuff that he talks about there. And yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. We will see you later on Drew the Catholic. Bye.